In this episode of Taboo with No Take, I will be discussing sexual assault. Sexual assault is a topic that not many people bring up in a social or academic setting. I would like to break the stereotype and talk about it because it's a topic that needs to be addressed. Especially in college, sexual assault is, unfortunately, a prevalent occurrence, one that often gets swept under the rug due to the survivor's feelings on the experience. For today's episode, I looked at 5 texts trying to understand why sexual assault is so negatively viewed. Sexual assault is a tough subject for many to talk about due to this view, but this mentality is something that I think we can overcome through knowledge and teaching. In today's society, sexual assault survivors are looked down upon because of preconceived notions along with social and systemic mindsets. In my first article, the author, Tasha Bourdaire, looks through many texts and deciphers multiple social reasonings as to why sexual assault survivors don't tell of their experiences. She finds that sexual assault survivors are further oppressed in scholarly literature, stating that they are called episodic drinking women whose alcohol consumption contributed to their assault and whose struggle with emotional regulation and management will cause them to be re-victimized. This thinking, I feel, is prevalent throughout society as many sexual assault survivors often come forward saying they've been discredited by the media, digging into their past, or criticizing their dress and demeanor. Kelly Pinter, author of my second chosen article, adds to this narrative by stating sexual assault survivors' families reacted to the news of the crimes with disbelief, disapproval, and dismissal. That's from page 50 of her dissertation. Pinter shows us the reality that sexual assault survivors' families aren't always accepting of their situation. It's a sad reality, but something that must be addressed. These 2 authors showed me how society has affected views of sexual assault and survivors. Bourdaire showed how they are portrayed to the public, and Pinter showed us the repercussions of those portrayals. With this knowledge of how society reacts to survivors, I feel we should also talk about how this thinking affects them. Bourdaire brings up research on loss and trauma that shows survivors are psychologically affected in the form of neurological changes to the brain. This comes from page 33 of her article. She further states that survivors' brains are on high alert as a result of bereavement and trauma, but with low awareness, again coming from page 33. These circumstances, as Bourdaire also notes on page 33, make it difficult to decipher between danger and safety. I feel that these points are very important as they bring attention to not only first-hand feelings about sexual assault, but also the research that backs how survivors feel and react to their experience. Kamal Sharma Patel et al. In their work cite cognitive theory study for sexual assault survivors. They cite, examine changes in physiological reactivity and linguistic indexes of cognition and emotion in participants writing about an upsetting, stressful, or neutral event and found that those in former group versus control exhibited significantly elevated heart rate activity during the first session. This comes from page 154 of their work. This is important background information for the rest of their study as it lays foundational knowledge that sets up what is presented later. They find that writing about one's traumatic experience statistically helps reduce symptoms of depression, but overall, they feel that treatments that can reduce negative sequelae could better direct innovative interventions and overcome barriers to service access and delivery. This comes from pages 164 and 166. These studies show how cognitive function is impaired. Bourdaire talks about how cognition is directly impaired, where Sharma Patel et al. Talk about how survivors' cognition has historically been affected. I feel that both of these sources provide a great overview of how cognition has affected the survivor themselves and how it has been studied before. These sources are great for understanding how people have already looked into changes of cognitive function for sexual assault survivors and understanding the nuanced nature and situation they are placed in. With this knowledge, we can see how society's views have affected survivors' minds and their rationale. Now, in order to fully understand survivors, we have to understand how they seek help or why they choose not to. Lai Ching-Young states in her piece that sexual assault survivors sometimes don't report violence at all or underreport it because they do not trust the justice system. That comes from page 929 of her article. This thinking is, from my experience, very common. Many survivors feel that the system doesn't favor them, and by putting themselves in such a vulnerable and public situation, they're making their healing process worse. They're dragging out the situation, whereas by never reporting it, they're ending its time in their lives. In Chelsea Spencer et al.'s work, we can see a variety of responses to sexual assault from survivors showing us why many don't report the assault. Many of the responses to Spencer et al. Study revolve around emotions felt. These responses give us a great overall view of what survivors feel about their experience and why they don't come forward with it. However, one response stuck out to me, stating, "It was not a big enough deal." This comes from page 171 of their work. At first, I was very shocked about this type of response, but upon further inspection, I realized that it could be because of sexual assault's taboo nature. Due to sexual assault not being avidly talked about or taught, many people are unaware of what sexual assault fully entails. Sexual assault, as defined by the Office of Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice, is any non-consensual sexual act prescribed by federal, tribal, or state law, including when the victim lacks capacity to consent. This definition helps us by introducing the term consent. Consent is defined as an agreement between participants to engage in sexual activity. This definition comes from the website for RAINN, or the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. This website also states that consent can be given and taken away at any time, meaning that if given the right to sexual activity before, upon consent being taken away, that previous given consent is null and void. All this information helps us to understand what consent and sexual assault fully mean. Through this knowledge, we will be able to help more people understand what they have gone through or what they may face. I feel that to move society forward, we need to be more open-minded, but also more accepting. This section of the podcast is going to be a little bit harder for me to talk about, but it comes from a place of experience and personal struggle. I am a survivor of sexual assault, but I consider myself lucky. I don't have any noticeable PTSD from the experience, at least as of now. However, like many other survivors, I don't really tell people this part of my story known as life. It's not something that I deem important in the grand scope of my life, at least not yet. This podcast is the first time I've ever taken this experience and utilized the lessons I've learned from it. Let's start off with that. After sexual assault, you start to see things in a different light. Bordeaux talks about this in her article. I started to see stories of sexual assault in a more connected way. I could relate my own experience to others and understand certain situations better than I could before the assault. I could see how perpetrators had similar workings, and that whatever the survivor or victim did, there was nothing that was going to stop the perpetrator once they put their mind to it. Now, throughout this podcast, I've used the word survivor to describe those who have been directly affected by sexual assault, but in this last segment, I bring up the word victim. This terminological disparity is mirrored in most every discussion about sexual assault. Survivor is a word with a positive connotation that shows that we have persevered through this experience and are strong and confident because of it. Victim is a word with a negative connotation, but one that shows the true nature of our part in this experience. Both words are used equally, but people usually choose between one another, often choosing survivor because of its positivity. But victim is a word that's strong and used more by the media. This vocabulary choice is very indicative of the public's view of sexual assault. It often disapproves of the assaulted, placing the blame for the experience on them, associating us with the negative. This thinking is what I hope to phase out through the distribution of knowledge, but I feel that this research is only one part of a complementary piece. I feel that there needs to be work of the cognitive functions of sexual assault perpetrators, but I feel that only survivors would be interested in that type of research. However, with that belief, I also believe that research about something of that magnitude would be far too close to trauma for a survivor to safely immerse themselves in. On the other hand, though, I think that it is important for sexual assault perpetrators to be studied so that proven research can show that they are at fault in these situations. Hopefully, research can show that they, no matter what was said or done, assaulted someone those days or nights. They are the ones to blame. They might not have planned it ahead of time, but in those key instances where consent was most needed, they ignored it. I feel that talking about sexual assault is important and should be interwoven into academic settings more often. However, I feel that more research is required for a fuller picture of sexual assault to be portrayed so that the necessary change happens. Through this research, I was able to see more examples of people like me and how they reacted to their situations. Through this episode, I was able to feel more comfortable with my decisions and how I acted in those instances. I feel like this was a great learning experience for me, as I hope it was for you. I hope that this podcast helps you understand sexual assault survivors on a different level and hopefully opens you to what we experience. Thank you for listening to Taboo with No Take. I hope you tune into the next episode. Until then.